Hello everyone, welcome to my channel tonight. We talk about the true crime stories. The humid night air of Dallas in early January usually carries a certain stillness, a quiet expectation that the new year brings for those looking to build something lasting. It was a Friday night, January 10th, the kind of evening where the city's neon lights reflect off the damp pavement, creating a blurred mosaic of red and blue. Inside a professional music studio, a space typically reserved for the high-stakes alchemy of rhythm and poetry, the atmosphere was supposedly one of business. Radrick Davis, known to the world as Gucci Mane, had traveled to Texas not for conflict, but for the legitimate commerce of the industry he had helped define. He was there to meet with artists he had mentored, names that were becoming synonymous with his own 1017 label, Lontrell Williams Jr., the rapper known as Pooh Shiesty, and Rodney Lamont Wright Jr., known as Big 30. At the time, it seemed like a routine gathering of a musical dynasty, a moment for strategy and collaboration. But as the clock ticked toward the midnight hour, the air inside the studio began to shift. The familiar hum of the mixing board and the muffled acoustics of the recording booth started to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a trap. The neighborly trust that defines a mentorship was about to be replaced by a cold, coordinated violence that few could have seen coming. It was a typical winter afternoon when the group began what should have been a standard business session in the heart of Dallas. They expected nothing more than the finalization of contracts and the creative spark of new tracks. But what unfolded behind those soundproof doors would change the history of the 1017 label forever. Hidden in plain sight for months, a brewing resentment and a calculated plan were about to be unmasked. One that proved the most dangerous monsters are often the ones we invite into our inner circle. Tonight, we look into the quiet shadows of a betrayal that nearly cost a legend his life and sent a shockwave through the federal justice system. As you settle in and adjust your volume, try to visualize the interior of that studio, the soft glow of the monitor screens, the smell of expensive cologne and stale coffee, and the sudden jarring realization that the exits have been blocked. The transition from a business meeting to a federal crime scene happened with a surgical, terrifying precision. Pooh Shiesty, a man Gucci Mane had signed and supported, allegedly stood not as a protege, but as an aggressor. According to the federal complaint later released by the Department of Justice, Shiesty and a group of 8 other co-conspirators, including his own father, Lontrell Williams Sr., had not come to record. They had come to execute what the U.S. attorney would later describe as a coordinated armed takeover. The presence of firearms in a music studio isn't always an anomaly in the high-pressure world of rap, but the way these weapons were brandished signaled a different intent. There was no heat of the moment argument, no sudden flare of tempers. Instead, there was a chillingly calm command of the space. Investigators would later find that the group had moved in concert, blocking the doors and ensuring that the high-value individuals inside, including Gucci Mane and 3 other music industry professionals, had no path to the outside world. One of the most disturbing details to emerge from the official records involves the physical intimidation used to force a legal outcome. In the middle of the chaos, while firearms were leveled at the victims. One of the professionals was allegedly forced at gunpoint to sign a release form. It was a literal attempt to hijack a recording contract through the threat of death. While this was happening, the atmospheric quiet of the studio was shattered by the sounds of a struggle. The Department of Justice noted that one victim was choked by one of the defendants to the point of near unconsciousness. Imagine the sensation of the air leaving your lungs in a room designed for sound, where the walls are built to ensure no one on the outside can hear a scream. Pooh Shiesty himself allegedly used his own body to barricade the studio door, acting as a human lock to ensure the robbery could be completed without interruption. As the victim stood frozen, the conspirators began a systematic stripping of wealth. Rolex watches, heavy gold jewelry, and large sums of cash were taken with the kind of efficiency usually reserved for professional heists. The 1017 chains, symbols of a brotherhood and a brand, were now being handled as mere loot. Radrick Davis, a man who had survived the lean years of the Atlanta streets to become a global icon, found himself back in a life-or-death struggle. But this time, the threat came from the very people he had brought to the table. The federal records show that the attackers didn't just want the money. They wanted the submission of those who had helped them rise. The irony was heavy in the room. A business meeting intended to grow a brand was being used to dismantle the safety of its founder. What makes this case particularly fascinating is the digital trail left behind in the hours following the takeover. In the modern era, the line between reality and social media bravado often blurs. But for these defendants, that blur became a roadmap for federal agents. Within hours of leaving the Dallas studio, several of the suspects began posting videos and photos to Instagram, proudly displaying the stolen Rolexes and the stacks of cash they had just taken at gunpoint. One particular screenshot from DeMarcus Glover's social media would later become a key piece of evidence in the government's case. It showed a lack of remorse that was almost atmospheric in its coldness, a digital celebration of a federal kidnapping. They were operating under the belief that their status rendered them untouchable, forgetting that the U.S. Attorney's Office views a music studio in Dallas with the same gravity as a bank vault. At the time of the offense, Pooh Shiesty was supposed to be under home detention for a prior firearms conspiracy charge in Florida. The sheer audacity required to travel across state lines to Dallas while under federal supervision to commit a kidnapping is the kind of detail that keeps investigators up at night. It suggested a total disregard for the structures of law and a belief that the legitimate business they were ostensibly there for was merely a front for more violent pursuits. Ryan Raybould, the United States Attorney for the Northern District of Texas, made it clear during a 15-minute press conference that this was not just a robbery. It was a violation of the community's safety. He noted that the victims had come to Dallas to conduct legitimate business and were met with a level of violence that belongs in a nightmare, not a professional workspace. As we move deeper into this story, we see the meticulous way the authorities began to piece together the movements of the 9 individuals involved. 8 were swiftly arrested in a multi-state sweep that spanned Dallas, Memphis, and Nashville. The names Kadarius Waters, Terrence Rogers, Demarion Gibson, DeMarcus Glover, Corday Johnson, and Darian McDaniel were added to the federal registers alongside the rappers they followed. The evidence was overwhelming, grounded in both physical testimony and the digital arrogance of the perpetrators. For Gucci Mane, the survival of that night was not just a matter of luck, but a testament to a career defined by navigating the most treacherous waters of the American dream. The questions remained, lingering like the smoke in a dark room. How did a mentorship crumble so quickly? And what does it say about the price of success when your own circle becomes your greatest threat? Before we move on to the specific forensic details of the arrests and the harrowing testimony of those who were inside the room, I want to take a moment to acknowledge those of you who are still awake and listening. Many people find that hearing these stories of justice being served helps them process the complexities of the world before they sleep. If you're settling in, let me know where you're listening from. Whether you're in a quiet apartment in the city or a house in the suburbs, it's good to have you here. We are safe, we are warm, and we are going to continue retracing the steps of a journey defined by resilience and the unmasking of a betrayal that the federal government refused to let slide. The fallout from the Dallas studio takeover would eventually lead to the possibility of life in prison for those involved. It served as a stark, chilling warning that using intimidation as a business tactic is a recipe for disaster. The 1017 takeover wasn't just a crime. It was a moment where the music stopped and the reality of the legal system took over. As the rain continues to fall outside your window, think about the silence of that studio after the doors finally opened. A silence that would later be filled by the heavy footsteps of investigators and the rustle of federal paperwork that would ensure these monsters in plain sight were finally brought to light. Welcome back to Midnight Sleep Crime. Tonight, we settle into the cold, neon-lit reality of a business meeting in Dallas that was never meant to be about music. Imagine the rhythmic hum of a mixing console in a high-end recording studio. The air is typically thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the metallic tang of electronics. A space where dreams are polished into platinum records. Radrick Davis, known to the world as Gucci Mane, entered this particular studio expecting the routine paperwork of a mentor, a moment to solidify the future of his 1017 label. He walked in with the quiet confidence of a man who had already survived the hardest streets of Atlanta, never imagining that the young men he had pulled from the shadows were waiting to pull him back into them. The transition from a professional handshake to a federal crime scene is a chilling one. It was a typical Texas evening in January, the kind of night where the city light's reflection on the wet pavement creates a deceptive sense of calm. Gucci Mane thought he was there for a contract signing, a milestone for his protégés Pusciesti and Big 30. But as the heavy soundproof doors clicked shut, the atmosphere shifted from collaborative to predatory. This wasn't just a robbery, it was a federally coordinated kidnapping trap, executed by the very people who called him Big Goat. How does a mentor become the prey of his own protégés? It's a question that investigators would spend months untangling. In the quiet of that Dallas studio, the 1017 family bond was severed in an instant. A coordinated armed takeover occurred, turning the room where Gucci had expected to witness the next generation's rise into a cage. The victims, including music industry professionals who came for legitimate business, were met with firearms and violence that felt more like a movie script than a business meeting. But this was reality. As the rain continues to fall outside your window, visualize the stillness of that studio before the madness began. The spinning record, the low hum of the console, the quiet rustle of paper. Among that paperwork was a release form for a recording contract, a document that one of the victims was forced to sign at gunpoint. This is the heart of the mystery tonight. What was on that form that made it worth a life sentence? As we settle in, let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. We're glad you're here as we unmask the monster in plain sight. In the coming hours, we will retrace every step of that Dallas night, examining how the promise of 1017 turned into a federal indictment that left the rap world in a heavy, contemplative silence. To understand the gravity of what occurred in Dallas, we have to look at the foundation of the 1017 label, a brand that for years had been synonymous with the resurrection of Atlanta's trap scene and the keen eye of its founder, Radrick Davis, known to the world as Gucci Mane. Gucci wasn't just a rapper, he was a talent scout with a Midas touch. And when he signed Lontrell Williams Jr., the young Memphis firebrand known as Pooh Shiesty, it felt like the crowning achievement of a new era. The relationship between the two was, on the surface, one of mutual respect and immense professional potential. Shiesty was the protege, the rising star whose raw energy and distinctive flow were supposed to carry the 1017 torch into the next decade. Their bond appeared to be the kind of mentorship that defines the music industry, built on the promise of multi-platinum records and shared success. The date was January 10th, and the setting was a professional music studio in the heart of Dallas. For the music industry professionals traveling to the city that day, it was supposed to be a routine Tuesday, a day defined by the quiet hum of soundboards, the smell of expensive cologne and studio foam, and the technicalities of contract negotiations. They were coming to meet with Shiesty and his inner circle to finalize the details of a legitimate business arrangement. In the high-stakes world of the music industry, a studio is supposed to be a sanctuary of creation, not a cage. It is a place where voices are captured and dreams are quantified into digital files. There was no reason for these professionals to feel anything other than the standard professional anticipation that comes with high-level label meetings. They arrived at the studio as the golden hour light began to hit the Dallas skyline, casting long amber shadows across the pavement. To the outside observer, it was just another session in a city known for its vibrant pulse. The professionals brought with them the tools of their trade, laptop bags, legal documents, and the expectation of a standard, albeit high-level contract negotiation. They expected to discuss distribution, royalties, and the future of the 1017 brand. What they didn't know was that the architectural plans for this meeting hadn't been drawn up by a label executive or a lawyer. Behind the scenes, the atmosphere was being curated by a different kind of influence. While Gucci Mane arrived expecting to conduct the kind of business that had made him a mogul, a darker coordination was unfolding. It would later be revealed by federal investigators that the architect of the evening's true agenda was not a music mogul at all, but rather Lontrell Williams Sr., Pooh Shiesty's own father. The elder Williams wasn't there to discuss melodies or marketing budgets. He was there to oversee a takeover. As the participants gathered and the heavy soundproof doors clicked shut, the air in the room didn't just change, it vanished. The silence that follows the closing of a studio door is usually a sanctuary for a musician, a vacuum where only the beat and the rhythm are allowed to exist. But on this January night in Dallas, that silence became a weapon. As Gucci Mane and the other music industry professionals settled into what they believed was a high-stakes negotiation, the atmosphere curdled. It happened in an instant, a sudden, synchronized movement that shattered the illusion of a business meeting. 9 men, a group that included Pooh Shiesty and Big 30, didn't reach for lyric sheets or adjust their headphones. Instead, they reached for the cold, heavy weight of firearms. The transition was so seamless, it felt practiced, a coordinated armed takeover that turned a place of creativity into a federal crime scene. The very artists Gucci Mane had come to sign, men like Lontrell Williams Jr., known to the world as Pooh Shiesty, and Rodney Lamont Wright Jr., known as Big 30, were no longer collaborators. They were captors. The psychological shock of that moment is hard to overstate. 1 minute, you are discussing the future of a record label and the distribution of millions of dollars. The next, you are staring down the barrel of a handgun. The cold steel of a handgun replaced the silver of the microphone, turning a room built for sound into a box of silence. It wasn't just the presence of the guns that shifted the energy to a state of pure dread. It was the tactical nature of the betrayal. Pooh Shiesty, a man who stood to gain everything from a legitimate partnership with 1017, took a position that made his intentions undeniable. He moved to the studio exit, using his own body as a human barricade. He stood there, back to the door, eyes fixed on the victims, ensuring that the only way out was through him and the weapon he carried. Ask yourself, if the exit was blocked by the very person you came to sign, where would you turn? There was no back door, no window to crawl through in a soundproof bunker designed to keep the world out. The victims looked around the room, seeing familiar faces now twisted into masks of aggression. It would later be revealed that this wasn't a crime of opportunity or a heated argument that spiraled out of control. It was a premeditated federal kidnapping, orchestrated with a level of precision that suggested a deep-seated distrust of the very industry that had made them famous. The presence of Pooh Shiesty's father, Lontrell Williams Sr., added a layer of generational coldness to the scene. This was a family business, but the business was violence. The realization washed over Gucci Mane and his associates like a wave of ice water. They were trapped in a room where the walls were thick enough to dampen the sound of a gunshot, miles away from anyone who could help. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of gun oil and the sharp, metallic tang of fear. Every movement by the conspirators was deliberate. They didn't just want the jewelry or the Rolex watches, though those would be taken soon enough. They wanted control. With the doors barred and the exits sealed, the true motive began to emerge from the shadows of the booth. The demand was made, and it sent a chill through the room. It wasn't just about money. It was about the paperwork. The air in the Dallas music studio had grown thick, not with the creative energy of a recording session, but with the suffocating weight of a predatory ambush. While the initial moments of the takeover were defined by the loud, jarring presence of firearms, the focus now shifted to a terrifyingly quiet kind of violence. In the center of the room, under the harsh glow of the overhead lights, a single sheet of paper was produced. It was a release form from a recording contract, a document that, in any other setting, would represent a milestone in a musician's career. Here, however, it was being used as a tool of legal erasure. One of the victims was moved toward the desk, the cold steel of a rifle barrel pressed firmly against their person. The demand was simple and devastating. Sign the paper or lose your life. This was the moment the business meeting officially transformed into a scene of procedural horror. There is a specific kind of chilling irony in using a legal document to facilitate a federal crime. A signature is usually a mark of progress, but under the barrel of a rifle, it becomes a desperate plea for survival. As the victim's hand hovered over the paper, the only sound in the room was the heavy breathing of the men surrounding them and the faint, scratchy rhythm of a pen being forced across the page. The legal implications of this act are profound, falling under the grim category of robbery by coercion. In the eyes of the law, using violence to force a legal signature is just as much a theft as taking a wallet from a pocket. It is the theft of a person's future, their rights, and their professional autonomy. To ensure this coercion was absolute, Kadarius Waters, Terrence Rogers, and Demarion Gibson stood as a wall of intimidation. They weren't just bystanders. They were active participants in the psychological breaking of the victims. They moved with a practiced coordination, shifting their weight and adjusting their grip on their weapons whenever the victim hesitated. The presence of these men created a perimeter of fear that made escape feel like a distant, impossible dream. Waters and Rogers provided the muscle, their eyes fixed on the victims, while Gibson ensured that no one could interfere with the signing. It was a calculated display of power designed to show that in this room, the law of the gun had replaced the law of the land. Perhaps the most surreal element of this entire ordeal was the status of the man leading the charge. Even as he orchestrated this violent takeover and demanded signatures at gunpoint, Pooh Shiesty was technically under the watchful eye of the government. Records would later show that he was already on federal home detention during this exact hour, stemming from a prior firearms conspiracy charge in Florida. It is a detail that adds a layer of brazen defiance to the night's events. While a GPS monitor likely sat tucked beneath his clothing, recording his location, he was allegedly miles away from where he was supposed to be, holding a music industry professional captive. This wasn't a crime of passion or a sudden outburst of anger. It was a structured, multi-man operation that treated a recording studio like a battlefield. The victims weren't just being robbed, they were being processed. Every second that passed, while that pen moved across the release form, felt like an eternity, a slow-motion descent into a reality where their professional lives were being dismantled by the very people they had come to do business with. But the contract, was only the beginning of the night's greed. The atmosphere inside the Dallas studio shifted from a tense legal coercion into a visceral physical nightmare. Once the release forms had been signed at gunpoint, the professional facade vanished entirely, replaced by a raw and systematic plundering. It was here that the illusion of safety, that fragile sense of security the victims had carried into the building, was finally and permanently shattered. They weren't just business associates anymore. They were targets in a high-stakes extraction. The violence escalated with a terrifying suddenness. One of the victims found themselves trapped, not just by the walls of the studio or the locked doors, but by the physical grip of one of the defendants. As the confrontation reached its peak, this individual was seized and choked with such force that the world around them began to blur and darken. The sound of labored breathing filled the small, acoustic-treated room, a rhythmic, desperate struggle for air that contrasted sharply with the silence of the recording equipment. There is a specific kind of terror that comes when the basic ability to breathe is stripped away, and in those moments, the victim was pushed to the very edge of unconsciousness. As the light began to fade for the victim being choked, the glitter of stolen diamonds was the last thing they saw. While this life-threatening struggle unfolded, the rest of the group, including Rodney Wright Jr., known to the music world as Big 30, began the methodical process of stripping the victims of their personal wealth. This wasn't a panicked grab for cash. It was a coordinated theft. The attackers moved with a predatory efficiency, demanding the Rolex watches that circled the victims' wrists. There is a coldness to the floor of a professional studio, a tactile reminder of the sterile environment that had now become a cage as jewelry was tossed aside or stuffed into pockets. High-value chains, rings, and large sums of cash, money intended for the business of music, were redirected into the hands of the 8 suspects. Big 30's presence, alongside Pooh Shiesty and the other 6 arrested individuals, solidified the prosecution's claim of a coordinated armed takeover. They had transformed a place of creativity into a vault, and they were the only ones with the combination. The victims were forced to watch as their hard-earned success, represented by the gold and stones they wore, was systematically harvested. The glint of a watch face under the studio lights served as a final, mocking reminder of the status they were losing in real time. Each piece of jewelry removed was a layer of their identity being peeled away under the threat of death. The systematic robbery left the victims physically battered and emotionally hollowed out. They had come to Dallas to conduct legitimate business, expecting the standard protections of the industry, but they found themselves at the mercy of a crew that valued the immediate shine of a Rolex over the long-term potential of a partnership. The suspects, including the father-son duo of the Williams family and their associates, had successfully neutralized the room. They had the watches and the jewels, but they didn't realize that time was already running out for them. The very items they were currently admiring would soon become the digital breadcrumbs leading federal investigators straight to their doors. For now, however, the room remained heavy with the scent of fear and the lingering sound of the struggle. a silent testament to a business meeting that had descended into a federal crime. In the immediate aftermath of the robbery, as the adrenaline began to fade, a different kind of energy took hold of the suspects. It was an arrogance born from the very digital world that had propelled their musical careers to the top of the charts. While the victims were left to process the trauma of the choked-out silence and the cold steel of firearms, the perpetrators were already reaching for their smartphones. Within hours of leaving that Dallas music studio, the transition from a physical crime to a digital trail had begun. The defendants, seemingly convinced of their own untouchability, began to post the stolen items on Instagram and other social media platforms. It was a fatal mistake, a moment of high-definition hubris that would later become the cornerstone of the federal government's case. They weren't just celebrating a successful heist. They were meticulously documenting their own downfall, frame by frame. To them, the gleaming surfaces of the stolen Rolexes and the heavy weight of the diamond chains were trophies to be displayed to their followers. To the U.S. Department of Justice, however, these posts were something else entirely. They were self-signed confessions broadcast in real time to the entire world. Investigators would later highlight one particularly damning piece of evidence: a video posted directly to DeMarcus Glover's Instagram account. In the blue light of the smartphone screen, the stolen jewelry shined with a brilliance that was hard to miss. There they were, the exact high-value items that had been ripped from the victims only a short time prior. The Rolex watches, which we remember were the primary targets during that coordinated armed takeover, were being flaunted before a digital audience of thousands. The repetitive whoosh of refreshing a social feed, usually a sound of engagement and fan interaction, had become the sound of a closing trap. The Department of Justice began a quiet, surgical collection of this digital evidence. Every story, every live stream, and every static post was being archived by federal agents who understood the information half-life of social media. They watched as the suspects displayed federal evidence to the public, seemingly oblivious to the fact that every pixel was a breadcrumb. This wasn't a case that required a complex web of informants or months of undercover work to identify the players. The players were identifying themselves, tagging each other in the very moments they should have been remains hidden. There is a profound irony in the way these rappers conducted themselves in the hours following the crime. The same platforms they used to build their brands, to connect with fans, and to project an image of success and power were now being used to build a cage. They treated the federal investigation like a music video shoot, failing to realize that the U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Texas was watching from the front row. The arrogance of the perpetrators was so absolute that they didn't just hide the evidence, they monetized it for clout. While the suspects celebrated online, basking in the temporary glow of their stolen riches, the U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Texas was beginning to build a cage of his own. The digital footprints left on social media were more than just evidence. They were a roadmap for a combined force of federal and local law enforcement that had been quietly mobilizing across state lines. While the suspects were busy counting stolen cash and admiring their new Rolexes in the humid air of Memphis and Nashville, the FBI was coordinating a multi-agency strike. This wasn't a standard local investigation. When the U.S. Department of Justice enters the fray, the atmosphere changes from a pursuit to a systematic dismantling. Federal justice moves with a quiet, glacial weight, slow to start, but impossible to stop once it gains momentum. The Northern District of Texas didn't work alone. They activated a network that stretched from the concrete sprawl of Dallas to the musical hubs of Tennessee, ensuring that when the hammer fell, there would be nowhere left to run. One by one, the names on the indictment were checked off. Corday Johnson and Darian McDaniel soon found themselves in handcuffs, part of a sweep that ultimately snared 8 out of the 9 suspects. For these men, the reality of their situation was likely beginning to sink in. They weren't being processed at a local precinct for a simple robbery. They were being ushered into the federal system, where the rules of engagement are far more rigid and the consequences far more permanent. As the investigators peeled back the layers of the suspects' backgrounds, a particularly troubling detail emerged regarding the man at the center of the storm. Pooh Shiesty, the rising star of the 1017 label, wasn't a stranger to the federal gaze. At the very moment he was allegedly barricading the studio door in Dallas, he was supposed to be under home detention. He was already dealing with a prior firearms conspiracy charge and conviction originating from the Southern District of Florida. To the federal prosecutors, this wasn't just a new crime. It was a brazen violation of the court's trust. It painted a picture of a man who felt he was above the reach of the law, even while wearing its shackles. To understand why these men are now facing the possibility of spending the rest of their lives behind bars, we have to look at the specific legal mechanism the government is using: the Armed Takeover Statute. In the eyes of federal law, this isn't treated as a mere theft. An armed takeover implies a coordinated tactical strike where multiple individuals use overwhelming force and the display of firearms to seize control of a location and its occupants. It's a charge designed to combat organized, high-stakes violence, because it involves the brandishing of weapons to facilitate a kidnapping and robbery. The sentencing guidelines escalate rapidly. Under these statutes, the minimums are high, and the maximum is life. There is no parole in the federal system. If the heavy doors of a federal penitentiary swing shut behind you, they stay shut. The weight of this realization began to settle over the case as the public learned just how deep the coordination went. This wasn't a crime of opportunity or a heat-of-the-moment lapse in judgment. The authorities were beginning to argue that this was a calculated, cold-blooded maneuver. It was a strategy of intimidation that relied on the very people Gucci Mane should have been able to trust the most. As the fingerprints were processed and the statements were recorded, the true nature of the conspiracy started to crystallize. This wasn't just a robbery. It was a betrayal of the highest order, led by a father and son duo. The bond between a mentor and a protege is often described as a sacred contract in the music industry. But in the case of Radrick Davis, the man the world knows as Gucci Mane, that contract was shredded by the very people he brought into his inner circle. To understand the gravity of what happened in that Dallas studio, we have to look past the flashy jewelry and the federal charge sheets. and peer into the fractured psychology of the Williams family. Lontrell Williams Sr. was not just a bystander or a father watching his son's career from the sidelines. According to the federal complaint, he was a primary architect. There is something deeply melancholic about a father helping to plan and execute the kidnapping of the man who provided his son with a legitimate path out of the struggle. Investigators found that Williams Sr. played a pivotal role in the coordination of the armed takeover, turning a business meeting into a tactical ambush. It suggests a family dynamic where the rules of the street took precedence over the rules of professional gratitude. For Gucci Mane, the impact of this wasn't just financial or physical. It was a profound psychological blow. Radrick Davis had spent years rebuilding his life and his brand, turning 1017 into a brotherhood that promised a new start for young artists. To be targeted by Pooh Shiesty, an artist he had championed, marketed, and treated like kin, created a sense of isolation that no amount of success could mask. The records show that while Shiesty used his own body to barricade the studio door, preventing his mentor's escape, he was acting under a philosophy of betrayal that had been nurtured at home. As the federal net tightened, the 1017 Brotherhood began to buckle under the weight of the indictments. This wasn't the kind of place where loyalty was a given anymore. It had become a landscape of suspicion. The psychological toll on Davis must have been immense, realizing that the house he built was being burned down from the inside by the very people he had invited to the table. When the hand that feeds you is the one you decide to bite, the hunger that follows is eternal. It is a hollow victory to steal a Rolex when you have traded away your future and your reputation to get it. The conspiracy was a recipe for disaster from the very beginning. Within hours of the robbery, the defendants were already posting their stolen trophies on social media, a move that investigators described as both arrogant and amateurish. Yet, for the victims, the sight of those items being flaunted online was a reminder of how quickly a quiet life of professional success can be disrupted by pure evil and greed. The sense of safety that usually permeates a high-end recording session had been replaced by a thick fog of distrust. If you are still with us, settle in. The resolution of this betrayal is finally coming to light. We are seeing the final moments of a dynasty that chose violence over vision. The breakdown of this collective serves as a chilling reminder that in the shadows of the industry, a wolf in sheep's clothing is often closer than you think. The investigation was moving toward a climax that no one in the Memphis or Dallas scenes could have predicted. The press conference in North Texas was about to send a shockwave through the entire industry. The air in the press briefing room was thick with the sterile scent of floor wax and the quiet, rhythmic hum of cooling fans. For 15 minutes, U.S. Attorney Ryan Raybould stood before a forest of microphones, his voice a steady, low-frequency anchor in a sea of flashing camera lights. He wasn't there to discuss the charts or the music that had brought these men together. He was there to dismantle the illusion of a coordinated armed takeover. He spoke of the Northern District of Texas not as a backdrop for a music video, but as a jurisdiction where the law is a heavy, immovable object. As he laid out the details of that January night, The narrative of a business meeting gone wrong was replaced by the cold reality of federal kidnapping and robbery. Raybold's words were carefully chosen, designed to ground the listener in the sheer gravity of the moment. He described how 9 individuals had turned a space meant for creativity into a high-stakes prison, using firearms to dictate the terms of a contract that was never meant to be signed in blood. The U.S. attorney made it clear that while the world outside might see these rappers as larger-than-life figures, the law saw them only as defendants. He leaned into the microphone, his tone shifting from clinical to authoritative as he issued a specific, chilling warning to the community at large. He noted that there is a dangerous misconception in some circles that violence is a viable way to conduct business, a shortcut to power or a tool for contract negotiation. But as it turned out, that philosophy was a recipe for disaster. Raybold's message was a closed book with a life sentence for a cover, a reminder that justice in this district is not a suggestion. He spoke of the victims who had come to Dallas for legitimate professional reasons, only to be met with a chokehold and the cold steel of a handgun. It was a betrayal of the very industry they claimed to represent, a wolf in sheep's clothing moment that had finally been unmasked by the DOJ. Every defendant mentioned in that press conference, from the young stars to the fathers who allegedly helped plan the execution, was now facing the possibility of spending the rest of their natural lives behind federal bars. The weight of that potential sentence hung in the air, a vast and silent consequence for a night of coordinated violence. The prosecution was no longer just a theory. It was a paper trail of evidence, Instagram screenshots, and medical reports that told a story of a parent's worst nightmare. Investigators had found that the audacity of the crime was only matched by the speed of the arrests across Dallas, Memphis, and Nashville. As we look back at the chaos of that 911 call and the emergency context that started this journey, we see a community left grappling with the scars of a night that changed everything. The studio is quiet now. The stolen jewelry has been recovered, and the flashing lights have faded into the distance. But the silence that remains is different. It is the heavy, reflective silence of a story that has reached its legal plateau. The air is still, much like the quiet hours before dawn, as the reality of a life sentence begins to sink in for those who thought they were above the reach of the law. The studio is quiet now, the jewelry recovered, but the scars of that January night remain, etched into the history of a city that was forced to witness the breakdown of a dynasty. The silence that follows a storm is often heavier than the rain itself. In the world of high-stakes music and the shadows of the 1017 label, that silence has finally arrived. For Radrick Davis, the man the world knows as Gucci Mane, survival has become more than just a streak of luck. It is a testament to a strange, enduring resilience. In an industry that so often claims its legends before they have a chance to grow old, he remains. He has walked through the fire of the streets, the cold isolation of the prison system, and now the betrayal of those he once called his brothers in arms. As the legal wheels continue to turn, the defendants, Pusciesti, Big 30, and the others involved in that cold January takeover, remain in a state of suspended animation. They are no longer the stars of a music video or the kings of a digital empire. They are names on a docket, waiting for the finality that only a federal judge can provide. The jewelry that was once flaunted on social media is now evidence, locked away in cold steel cabinets. The bravado that filled the Dallas recording studio has been replaced by the sterile, quiet reality of a holding cell. They await a future that could span decades, a life measured in the slow ticking of a clock behind reinforced glass. It is a sobering end to a journey that began with so much promise, a reminder that the light of justice, though it may sometimes flicker, eventually finds its way into the darkest rooms. The story of the 1017 takeover is now a part of the past, a cautionary tale whispered in the corridors of the industry. It serves as a boundary line, marking the point where the persona of the outlaw meets the unyielding wall of the law. But as we sit here in the quiet of the night, that world feels miles away. The music continues to play somewhere out there, a rhythmic ghost of the energy that once drove this tragedy. But here, the rain falls softly against your window. It is a natural, steady heartbeat that drowns out the chaos of the streets. In the end, we realize that the most valuable thing stolen that night wasn't a Rolex or a diamond-encrusted chain. It was the peace of mind that we now reclaim in the silence. We have followed this path from the business meetings to the federal courtroom, through the kidnapping and the betrayal, and now we have reached the end of the narrative loop. The story is laid to rest. There are no more questions to answer, no more shadows to chase. The atmospheric bed of safety that surrounds you is real, a shield against the world we have just explored. Sleep now, knowing that the light of justice has found its way through the dark, and you are safe in the quiet of the night. The world is still, the story is told, and the rest you have earned is waiting for you in the fading hum of the rain. Rest easy. The gavel of the Northern District of Texas did not just fall. It resonated with the finality of a closing vault door. In the sterile, fluorescent-lit halls of the federal courthouse, the air always feels different than it does on the humid streets of Dallas or the vibrant, neon-soaked recording studios where this story began. Here, there is no bass, no rhythmic pulse of a drum machine, and no entourage to soften the edges of reality. There is only the dry crinkle of legal parchment and the steady, rhythmic breathing of a courtroom at rest. For Radrick Davis, the man the world knows as Gucci Mane, this was the moment where the high-stakes adrenaline of a business meeting turned kidnapping finally dissolved into the quiet, bureaucratic certainty of the American justice system. It is a transition from the chaotic to the orderly, a closing of a chapter that many thought would end in much darker shadows. As the sentencing hearings commenced for the 8 men who turned a music studio into a tactical battlefield, the atmosphere was one of profound resignation. Pooh Shiesty, born Lontrell Williams Jr., stood before the court not as the rising star of the 1017 label, but as a young man facing the immense, crushing weight of federal statutes. The transition from the stage to the defendant's table is a silent one, marked by the absence of the jewelry and Rolexes that had sparked the violence on that cold January night. The prosecution laid out the timeline one final time, a narrative of betrayal that saw a mentor targeted by his own protégés. They spoke of the coordinated armed takeover, the barricaded doors, and the chilling moment a recording contract was terminated not by a pen, but by the barrel of a firearm. The court heard once more about the victim who was choked to the point of near unconsciousness, a physical trauma that served as a visceral reminder of how close this business meeting came to becoming a tragedy beyond repair. The legal resolution for these individuals was as swift as the coordinated armed takeover they were accused of executing. Under the watchful eye of the U.S. Department of Justice, the sentences were handed down with a clinical precision that stands in stark contrast to the frantic energy of the crime. For many of the conspirators, the years ahead will be defined by the gray, unchanging walls of federal institutions, a far cry from the private jets and luxury studios of the music industry. The father, Lontrell Williams Sr., and the others who participated in the planning and execution of the robbery found that the social media posts they used to flaunt their stolen spoils had become the very digital breadcrumbs that led to their undoing. The prosecution's words echoed in the quiet room. This case served as a warning that violence is not a viable way to conduct business. It was a statement of institutional strength, a reminder that while the streets may have their own rules, the federal government has the final word. Gucci Mane himself has moved into a space of quiet reflection, surviving an ordeal of this magnitude, being kidnapped and robbed by those you brought into your inner circle, leaves a mark that isn't always visible. It is the kind of experience that shifts a person's perspective on trust and the nature of the industry he helped build. Yet there is a sense of peace in the resolution. The legal system, often criticized for its slow pace, worked with a deliberate momentum to ensure that those who chose intimidation over integrity were held to account. For the victims, the Rolexes and the cash are secondary to the return of their safety and the knowledge that the individuals who threatened their lives are no longer walking the same streets. The closure is total. There are no more appeals to wait for, no more mounting evidence to review, and no more shadows lurking in the corners of a studio session. Outside the courthouse, the world continues its frantic pace. But for you, in this moment, the air is still. The story of the Dallas kidnapping has reached its natural end, moving from the heat of the conflict to the cool, quiet halls of justice. It is a reminder that even in the most turbulent lives, there comes a point of stillness. The legal documents have been filed away in heavy steel cabinets. The digital files have been archived, and the voices of the investigators have trailed off into the silence of a job completed. There is a profound comfort in knowing that the chaos has been managed, that the monsters in plain sight have been identified and removed, and that the narrative has a definitive, peaceful conclusion. The rhythmic hum of the world outside your window is all that remains now. Think of the way the ink dries on a final court order, slowly, permanently, marking the end of a long and difficult road. The rappers, the lawyers, the federal agents, they have all stepped back into the shadows of history, leaving behind a story of survival and the eventual, inevitable triumph of order over disorder. Radrick Davis continues his journey, but the weight of this particular January night has been lifted from his shoulders by the hands of the law. You can feel that same lightness now, the shedding of the tension that comes from following a mystery to its core. The tension has evaporated, leaving only the soft, ambient glow of a world that has been set right. As you lie there, let the details of the courtroom, the polished wood, the soft rustle of robes, the hushed whispers of the gallery fade into a soft blur. The justice system has done its work. The streets of Dallas are quiet. The recording studios are once again spaces for creativity rather than crime. The betrayal has been answered with accountability, and the fear has been replaced by the steady, unblinking eyes of justice. There is nothing left to solve, nothing left to fear, and nothing left to wonder about. Every question has been answered by a transcript. Every victim has been heard, and every perpetrator has met the end of their chosen path. The vastness of the legal machine provides a strange kind of comfort, a sense that there is a structure to the world that holds even when things fall apart. It is a safety net that spans across the country, from Memphis to Nashville to Dallas, ensuring that those who seek to disrupt the peace are eventually brought into the quiet of a cell. As the sun sets on this case, it leaves behind a landscape that is safer, clearer, and more tranquil than it was before. The echoes of the gunfire at the studio have been drowned out by the silence of the sentencing, a silence that now wraps around you like a heavy, warm blanket. You are safe in the knowledge that this story is over. The individuals involved are miles away, locked in the slow progression of their own consequences, while you remain here in the sanctuary of your own space. The world is a place of patterns, and the pattern of this story has returned to its baseline of peace. The wolf in sheep's clothing has been unmasked and led away. The monsters are gone. What remains is the stillness of a room where the lights have been turned down, and the only sound is the gentle, rhythmic passing of time. The case of the Dallas studio kidnapping is a testament to the fact that truth eventually finds its way to the surface, and that survival is often followed by a deep, resonant quiet. Radrick Davis survived the meeting. He survived the betrayal, and he survived the trial. Now the world allows him and you the grace of moving on. The names Pooh Shiesty and Big 30 now belong to the records of the court, separated from the pulse of the present by the heavy doors of the federal system. They are part of the past now, a closed chapter in a book that has been placed back on the shelf. Feel the weight of your limbs as they settle into the bed, mirroring the way the case has settled into the archives. There is a profound exhaustion that comes after a long journey through the dark, but it is a good exhaustion, one that signals the beginning of a deep and restorative rest. The investigators have gone home. The lawyers have closed their briefcases. The judge has retired to their chambers. The entire apparatus of the law has finished its work for the day, and so have you. The story has been told in full, from the first whispered threat to the final echoing fall of the gavel. As the rain continues to fall outside, or the wind hums through the trees, let those sounds be the only things that occupy your mind. They are the sounds of a world that is functioning as it should, a world where the noise of conflict eventually gives way to the music of nature. The story of Gucci Mane's survival is not just a story of crime. It is a story of the transition from the storm to the calm. You are in the calm now. The air is cool, the blankets are heavy, and the room is filled with a sense of total resolution. The case is closed, the secrets are laid to rest, and you can finally close your eyes. If you aren't asleep yet, the story of the hidden cellar awaits you on your screen. Good night.